for coming to this week's broadcast seminar, and thank you to those of you who are tuning in online. I'm Rich Reddy. I'm the Associate Director of the Institute of Ecosystems here at Montana State. And so welcome to the seminar series. We have a good lineup for the whole semester. Next week we have Ben Poulter coming. And this week we have Dave McWethy. So Dave is an assistant professor in the Department of Earth Sciences here at Montana State. His research looks at how humans and climate and fire interact to determine the structure and biodiversity of forests. He's got ongoing projects in the Northern Rockies, the Pacific Northwest, New Zealand, Tasmania, and Africa. I think he needs an economist to come help him with his field research.
Definitely.
He's got external funding from places like National Science Foundation, U.S. Department of Agriculture, National Geographic, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. So I will turn it over to Dave, and welcome.
Great, thanks. Thanks for coming today. I'm excited to talk about some of the work we've been doing in the paleoecology lab. We're kind of silent over there, so please. But you kind of gave everything away, so I'll just summarize a little bit today. So I put this image up to start with just because this is just from a few weeks ago. It's a 10-day snapshot of fire activity around the world, and you can see we have some interesting things going on in the Pacific Northwest, Montana, Idaho, Washington, Oregon. But I also just want to highlight the fact that there's a lot of fire activity that goes on around the world all throughout the year. Obviously differs by season in the northern and southern hemisphere, but this is not unusual. Fire activity is a huge disturbance process in the world, and it really shapes ecosystems and the distribution of vegetation. It's a really important process, and that's why I work on it with Kathy Whitlock and all of our grad students in the paleoecology lab. If you were around Bozeman or anywhere in the Pacific Northwest, or most places, in August, you noticed it was harder to breathe. And what's interesting to me is that a lot of the smoke that we get in Montana is actually coming from very far away. You can see plumes from Washington heading over into Montana, and in other parts in the last couple of years, we've had lots of smoke coming in from the Yukon. So it's a very big phenomenon in terms of how it affects people in all of the western United States and Canada. It's really been in the media, and there's been a lot of people asking questions about, what is this the new norm? Is this fire activity normal? Is this something that's unprecedented, and what should we expect in the future? And so, you have charts like this. It's interesting for this year, how bad was the fire season this year up to date? And the actual number of fires is not that high. It's actually lower. And I'm not saying this is a statistically significant trend, but the number of acres is quite large. And so what we're seeing, at least in the last decade, is that even if you have years with less numbers of fires, the fires are quite big, especially this year. And in terms of trends in fire activity, if you look at the Rocky Mountains over here, things are trending up since the 1980s, and in most parts of the western United States, you do see some different trends in parts of California, but most of the trends are upwards, and people like Greg Peterson and others have documented some of the climatic drivers of this kind of inflection point around 1980 or so. And I guess the reason I show these is because fire is an important process, and things seem to be changing, and it's fun to study. So it's kind of whetting your appetite for what I'm going to talk about today. And one of the main questions that we ask in the paleoecology lab is, how are the controls on fire activity changing? And to what extent are humans involved in controlling fire activity, and how is land use interacting with climate and fire weather and fuels to change these conditions as well? And what insights can we gain from historical records? We, as paleoecologists, we like to say the past is the key to the future. And I hope you all believe that too, especially at the end of today's talk. So these are our primary research questions. And in terms of the scale that we operate, you can think of fire ecologists love triangles for some reason. Because they really help demonstrate some of the important controls on fire at different scales, from flame to individual fire to fire regimes. And this is kind of what we're most interested in, is the scale at which patterns of fire over time, development of vegetation and climatic trends influence ecosystems that we depend on. And that's kind of the scale at which our research operates. And in particular, I'm really interested in how humans and land use, not just from ignitions, but also how they alter vegetation, play a role in altering fire regimes. So here's one of my favorite diagrams that I made up. It's very complicated. And I was thinking about, well, how are our controls on fire activity changing? I found this really useful just to look at, well, how much fire activity do we have in a very general sense across a gradient biomes from wet to dry, rainforest to desert. And if you look at empirical data, you see that this may seem like a really simple conceptual diagram, but for the most part, the amount of carbon emissions from these different biomes, it kind of fits this normal distribution. And it looks a little funky in different parts of the world. This is gross primary productivity, net primary productivity. But if you look at, you can't really see this, but this is Australia and Asia and Argentina, Americas. It does fit that kind of normal distribution. And why is that? Well, if you think about it, the controls on fire, in rainforest settings, you've got plenty of fuel. But there's not a lot of fire activity because fuels are usually wet, or when you get ignitions, natural ignitions or even human ignitions, it doesn't occur when the fuels are dry enough to burn. So you may get plenty of fires, but they don't spread or they don't start. When you get ignitions, natural ignitions especially, they come with a lot of rainfall. So you just don't get fire spread. On the other end of the gradient, in desert systems and very dry systems, you just don't have, one, a lot of fuel available, and two, you don't have a continuous fuel. If it is there, it's not linked, so that if you get fire starts, they just die out right away. So you kind of have, the drivers of low fire activity on each end of the spectrum. And then where you have the greatest amount of fire activity is where you have a lot of fuel that's, especially fine fuels like grasses, that's continuous across the landscape. And you have ignitions during seasons when those fuels are dry. So you can see just some of the main control, the natural controls on why we have different levels of fire activity across these biomes. And while this is very obvious, it's really helpful for us to start asking questions about how these are changing. So essentially you have, on this end of the spectrum, climate limited, plenty of fuels, but they're just not dry enough to burn, or they're not dry when you have ignitions. And over here, you're fuel limited, or fuels are not continuous. So then we think about humans. Okay, how are humans interacting with these natural controls? Well, what we've been talking about when we started a lot of our projects around the world was that, in these areas where you have lots of fuel, you can see these rapid transitions, biome transitions. And if you target ignitions during times when fuels are dry, can you really fundamentally shift the fire regime? So that's a big question we have, both spatially and temporally. So when you have fuels that are dry, or if you target ignitions in really the small amount of dry fuels that are on the landscape. You can have other impacts by introducing non-native species, and that can help fuels become more continuous across the landscape or change the dynamics of fuels. And these can have, these human impacts can have dramatic influences on, actually shifting biomes at very large scales. On the other end of the spectrum, you can have, suppression of fuel fragmentation, which can have big influences also on biome shifts by reducing, the continuity of fuels where fire activity is really high, causing these biome shifts as well. So humans can have a big influence, and we kind of identified, these areas as being the ones that are, really interesting to look at, especially for me, this area where you have lots of fuels in the landscape, but for, a lot of reasons that the natural controls, they're not burning. You have low levels of fire activity, and the potential for people to alter these conditions by targeting ignitions in dry fuels and during the times of the year when things are dry can really fundamentally alter biomes and have a huge impact on the carbon cycle and other things. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today, or I'm going to talk about today. And I'm going to do that through a couple of case studies in Montana. From Montana, work, some work in central Mozambique, in New Zealand, Tasmania, and a new project also in central Chile. So just to take one step back, if you don't know how paleoecologists work, what we do in terms of looking at lake sediments is we try to find a small closed basin lake that produces records of past activity by incorporating charcoal, pollen, other things that fall in the lake and deposit in the mud at the bottom of the lake. So we go out and we collect a core, and you can see the laminations are really just a record of history. We have all the different proxy pollen, macrofossils, and both fine charcoal and larger pieces of charcoal that are deposited in these layers, and if we build a chronology for these, we can really reconstruct past conditions. And if you're a paleoecologist, if you're this happy when you get a core, Pico in here, she knows she was ecstatic for weeks after this. And, I know Tony's not here. Hartshorn's kids are this excited when they see soil. So, okay, so why kind of talk today about these different areas of the world? What's the connection between them? At least for 4 of the case studies, we're really talking about areas that have similar biophysical conditions. They overlap in, their kind of productivity and other environmental gradients, but they have very different land use histories, and they have very different fire histories, and their ecosystems are responding in different ways. And so it makes a really interesting comparison to look at sites in Southern America, temperate forests in Southern America, the Southern Hemisphere, and compare those with the Pacific Northwest, where these, the kind of biophysical controls are similar. So the first case example is one I've been working on with Kathy Whitlock and collaborators from New Zealand for over 7 years now. And just to kind of give you context, Polynesians started migrating from Southeast Asia 5,000 to 6,000 years ago and traveled all throughout Southeast Asia into the Pacific Basin. And New Zealand was the dating is pretty precise now that Maori Polynesians arrived around 780 years ago in New Zealand. And that's the last major colonization on Earth of a large landmass, the large island of New Zealand. So what's interesting about New Zealand is that the North Island, because of the climate there, folks were able to cultivate crops, and so they had relatively high, or higher densities, greater than 1 inhabitants per square kilometer. Whereas the South Island, because of frost and other climatic controls, they were not able to cultivate kumara and taro, some really important foodstuffs. So for the most part, the South Island had very low populations, and those populations continued to kind of operate, for the most part, as hunter-gatherers. They didn't really participate in any kind of agriculture or cultivation on the South Island because they couldn't. So we were really interested in looking at what kind of ecosystem transitions you have in New Zealand, especially on the South Island where you had very few people. When Europeans arrived in the 19th century, over 40% or almost half of the closed canopy forests in both the North and South Island were gone, had been transitioned or been converted to open scrub fernland. Very dramatic transition for, especially for the South Island where it's relatively wet. You have a big rain shadow with the Alps, so it is drier on the east side, but still to convert that much land, that much forest to open scrub and maintain that, it was quite a puzzle and a remarkable transition. So it's something we wanted to look at, how this was done and what were some of the mechanisms going on, especially given that, again, these were very small populations. So the pre-human landscape in New Zealand, again, was very closed forest, upwards of 90% or 95% closed podocarp and beech forests. And then your fire return intervals were very rare in terms of you had, in any given forest, you had a fire once every 1,000 years or even longer. So essentially, it was not shaping these forest systems. If you had a fire, it didn't spread very much, and by the time another fire came around, you had a closed canopy mature forest there again. So most tree species really were not well adapted to fire. They have thin bark. They're not able to resprout. You have high levels of mortality if you do get a fire. So what we did is there was a lot of pollen. We had a lot of information on vegetation change from our collaborators, Matt McGloin and Janet Wilmshurst and others, but we didn't really have a well-documented reconstruction of what happened with fire. And so that we set out to really to get that information by looking at a network of sites from lakes all over the South Island up to the extent of where that conversion occurred. If you remember that other figure, the west side, most of the forests remain intact, extremely wet forests. So we got sites all over the South Island, and when we put those records together, we have over 28 records now. You see this dramatic regime shift in the fire regime and also in the vegetation. So for the whole Holocene, essentially you have very little or no fire in most of these sites. And then when Polynesian Maori arrived, you get a major increase in charcoal accumulation and fire activity and a persistent shift from these closed canopy forests to open scrubland. And it's one of the most dramatic transitions at that scale seen anywhere in the world. And just to give you an example of one of the sites, this is quite representative of those 28 records in terms of the kind of vegetation change, but you have these native podocarp and beech forests. Polynesians arrive, Polynesian Maori arrive, fire activity goes up, and you see a coincident decrease in the native tree species, and grasses come up and a lot of bracken and fern, and this persists until today, even though you have periods of low fire activity during the record. And then Europeans typically also lit a lot of fires and expanded the amount of deforestation almost to the same extent as the Polynesians when they arrived, primarily to increase pasture for animals. But this is the kind of dramatic transition you see. So you've got native forest, mostly closed canopy, and this is kind of what the landscape looks like that hasn't converted until Europeans arrived, this bracken shrubland. And interestingly, it's the same, some of the same bracken species that you see in the Pacific Northwest after fires or disturbance. And then you get a kind of a secondary conversion with Europeans, but changing bracken shrubland to more of pasture. So one of the first questions we ask, of course, is, well, could climate be responsible for this transition? Is this just a coincidence that we have people arriving during a particularly unusual climatic period, extended drought or something like that. And if we look at reconstructions from silver pine by Ed Cook for the last 1,200 years, you see a lot of climatic variability, and we conducted a superposed epoch analysis to look at if this transition from very little fire activity to a lot of fire activity coincides with extreme temperature reconstruction, summer temperature reconstructions, and there's just no correlation, and it just doesn't really explain any of the variability we see. So it really kind of points to human-set fires as the main cause of this forest transition. And the next thing we asked is, well, how rapid? How rapid can you convert, relatively wet forests in a lot of the South Island of New Zealand to these bracken shrublands with just a small dispersed populations that are acting largely as hunter-gatherers. And by doing an extensive dating at several sites, we found that the transitions at any given site happen in years to decades, extremely rapid. And that really led us into, to ask these questions of, well, how the heck did this happen? How, not only did small populations, convert large forested areas, some very wet, to this bracken scrubland in years to decades. And working with George Perry at University of Auckland, and again, Matt McGlowan and Jan Wilmster at Landcare Research in New Zealand, and Kathy Whitlock here, one of the things that we kind of started toying with is just this idea that in the Western United States, post-fire, what were the post-fire conditions after fires were lit by people? Is this part of the puzzle, or an answer to the puzzle? And if you look at flammability hazard rate models in the United States, or that we typically use for North American systems, we see that the hazard function increases slowly, either linearly or logistically or exponentially, because fuels are low after you have a fire event in a lot of systems, and so you're slowly accumulating fuels, so your hazard function goes up. And to some degree, that just doesn't really match with some of the Southern Hemisphere systems, and also probably with some of the systems in North America as well. And it led us to look at this idea that, well, these bracken fernlands are actually quite flammable. And so you actually have the hazard model or the hazard function for a place like New Zealand fits this moisture model much better than these other models, where you have an elevated flammability following a fire, rather than kind of this depressed flammability that slowly increases with fuel accumulation. And maybe this is the more appropriate model, and maybe this kind of gives us some clues into how people maybe have started targeting ignitions during this time period and systems where you had a much higher landscape flammability, at least for a short period of time, to start expanding the amount of open systems. So the question really was, if people targeted ignitions in this highly flammable, post-fire state, could you trap succession and then just continue to, expand the amount of deforestation? So George Perry developed this spatially explicit simulation model, and basically a very simple model that represents the New Zealand landscape, where you have these yellow squares represent about the percentage of more flammable early seral vegetation that existed prior to human arrival, based on over 100 pollen records. And then you set a fire and you let it spread across the landscape, and the things that you're changing ignitions in terms of, are ignitions targeted in these early seral squares? Are they targeted in the native forest? And are they targeted during times when you have droughts or extremely hot conditions. So the big question is, when you change these parameters, how much can you get fire to spread, and how much land conversion or forest conversion can you get? And in a nutshell, what we found from the model is that if you target ignitions in early sterile vegetation, so really it's a spatial targeting, you get this feedback, this positive feedback, where you get more flammable vegetation on the landscape. If you target again in that, you just start expanding that, and you can get dramatic conversions, much more than you would expect from non-targeted ignition. So you get this kind of fire begets fire. If you keep lighting fires in that flammable young vegetation, you can get really dramatic spreads. And I won't go into detail here, but essentially, you can get to almost 50% of the landscape converted if you target just spatially. If you target temporally, meaning you target it during really dry periods or extended droughts, you can't get this. You can't get the kind of conversion. And the main reason being that in New Zealand, if you look at even if you use the whole range of climate variability, it's just too infrequent that you get extreme conditions. Even if you always light fires during a drought or a very bad year, they don't happen frequently enough where you can get the kind of land conversion that actually occurred. So it was really the spatial targeting that was the key. And just to, how often did you have to keep lighting fires? Well, a couple times every 5 to 10 years was sufficient to actually trap or maintain these open landscapes. So the key is, we think is really this, what's happening after you get a fire, is that you have this elevated flammability, and then you can trap that, and then you can get these really dramatic transitions, even from just a few individuals on the landscape. And this kind of applies to, we want to take this to other settings and look at, well, this moisture model, what if you increase the flammability by changing the type of species? You introduce more flammable species. Or you start losing organic soils, and your microclimate becomes drier. You actually change the shape of this moisture model, so you get either even more elevated flammability, or you extend the amount of time that the landscape is flammable. And we think this is kind of a theme that we're really excited about looking at in different places, and I'm going to kind of talk about now. So the next kind of place that we're working is Tasmania, and looking at early humans in the Bass Strait. And it's a really interesting place because during the last glacial maximum, this is Tasmania and this is southeastern Australia, the 130-meter isobar here shows that you could actually walk between Australia and Tasmania in the Bass. This was called the Bass Plains all the way up until around 8,000 years ago. So when you had sea level rise, started inundating the Bass Plains, we have archaeological data all over the Bass Plains showing that people were using this area extensively, moving back and forth between Tasmania and southeastern Australia. And then they people become isolated on islands in the Bass Strait, starting in 10,000 years ago, but around 8,000 years ago, there was essentially no way that you could get off the islands because Aboriginal populations did not have sophisticated boat technology. There's no archaeological evidence that there were boats being used to move between the islands or off. There are some very crude rafts that people were using to get around the coast, but to get out to these islands there's really no evidence suggesting that was possible. So, this kind of begs the question, well, what happens to these ecosystems when people are isolated on these islands? How do people interact with climate and change fire regimes and ecosystems? Especially given that in Flinders Island, all evidence of occupation or human presence disappears around 4,000 years ago. So what we have is you've got people living in the Basque Plains using these areas. The islands become isolated, and then people disappear on the islands just a few thousand years ago. So we have this kind of before-after. You've got people interacting with climate and lighting fires, managing the landscape, and then they're absent. So we wanted to collect a record from Flinders Island, where we know that this kind of presence and then absence occurred. So we collected a couple of peat cores from Flinders Island, just to give you a couple ideas of what the sites look like. And what we see in terms of the vegetation transitions, this is about a 12,000-year-old record. The cores are dominated by different species of eucalyptus, fairly fire adapted. And then you see kind of an increase in grasses. And then this dramatic increase in the orange here, this casuarina, which is an interesting species. It's somewhat drought tolerant, a little bit fire tolerant. And then you get this big rise in caliatris, which is interestingly considered somewhat of a wet forest species, but it's also extremely drought tolerant. So it needs to be established or get established in wet times, but it can withstand very severe droughts. So if we look at the other, the main drivers, the controls on this kind of transition, the first one I want to point out is that we had pretty high fire activity when, from 12,000 to around 5,000 years ago. And then if you do a regime shift detection analysis, you get a very significant regime shift for this time period in terms of the fire activity, returning to higher activity during the last several millennia. What I've got here is, this is kind of variability or intensity in ENSO activity, and you can see it increases pretty dramatically over the last 3,000 to 5,000 years. Conditions were generally quite cool, and then warm in the mid-Holocene, and then getting cooler again towards recent times. Lake levels suggest there was, it got a little wetter towards the, as you get towards the mid-Holocene, but then things dry out again for the last 5,000 years. So what are the main drivers? Well, during this first period where kind of break this regime, the fire regime shifts, you've got high fire activity, which is interesting because climate is fairly cold and mostly wet. So it doesn't really jive with just your basic understanding of the conditions that would drive high fire activity. Cold conditions and wet conditions would not do that. But this is the time period where people are on the island. Now, when people, you see significant depopulation and any absence of any archaeological evidence of people here, your fire activity drops down, conditions get warmer, but really suggests a significant shift in actually human-driven management of the fire regime. And then the last millennia, you get elevated, last several millennia, you get elevated fire activity that coincides with cool conditions, but a lot of variability in ENSO activity, but high intensity in ENSO activity. The last 3,000 years is very much characterized by extreme wet times and extreme dry times. You get extended droughts and also extended pluvials. So climate is certainly much more variable on Flinders Island during this time when caliatris takes over. When we look at what are the drivers, the main drivers of ecosystem change, and you look at an ordination over time of the main vegetation groups, really what stands out, you see you've got kind of a grass and eucalyptus groups that dominates during the early Holocene when people are present, and then that shifts to casuarina and coliatrus for the last 5,000 years. And really what's driving that is human-set fires here, or a combination of natural and human-set fires here during that 10,000 to 5,000 years, and then enso intensity comes up as the strongest driver of, the shift to a coliatrus community. And we think that has to do with some of the unique adaptations of coliatrus to extreme droughts, this flip-flop between really wet conditions and wet droughts. So really the big drivers for Flinders Island are climate. It really facilitates the expansion and contraction of these different veg groups, but vegetation types. But human-set fires certainly seem to be a real important driver when people are isolated on Flinders Island and before they leave. And we think that the availability of freshwater resources was really severely constrained when you start getting an uptick in the enso intensity. There's very few freshwater resources on the island, and we think that could have been one of the main reasons that folks were not able to persist on the island. So I'm going to talk just a minute about one of the projects we just started with Greg Peterson and Emily Heyerdahl from the Fire Lab, and Karen Nelson from the University of Montana, and Rick Everett from Salish-Kootenal College. It's a really exciting project for me to be able to work more in Montana, northwest Montana, and kind of, what spurred this research is some of what I started off with in the talk about what's happening with fire regimes in the Pacific Northwest. You see these images from the earliest 20th century, and you see this mosaic, and these are burned areas across the Mission Mountains. And then in more recent times, it's a much more homogeneous, closed forest type system. And the tribes are really interested in having longer records of fire histories, saying, is this, was this kind of the way things were for thousands of years? And now we have this anomalous kind of buildup of fuels or closing in of the canopy. Or, is this more what historical records look like? And this was anomalous, conditions that happened in the earliest 20th century. So we're working with Salish-Kootenal College and the tribes to really build up an understanding of past conditions for the Flathead Indian Reservation. And the main questions we have, one being a very simple one, how did fire regimes vary across different biophysical gradients? There's not a lot known about long-term fire history in the mission or on the reservation. Second, how did people manage landscapes? Can we detect, the influence of people at long time scales, or is that really difficult to separate from climatic influences? And then lastly, how do we use these historical records to see how these forest types responded to really key periods in climatic variability, like the Little Ice Age and the medieval climate anomaly? How did they respond, and what can we learn from that if we want to promote more resilient forests into the future? So we're just kind of getting started on this project, and we're pairing lake sediments with tree rings. Lake sediments being a very powerful tool for reconstructing long fire histories at coarser scales. They do a very good job of picking up high severity fires. And tree ring records do a really nice job of resolving moderate and low severity fires for the last couple hundred years. So we're pairing these across this very kind of binary gradient. We've simplified, even though it's not in real life, certainly binary, but areas where we know there was a lot of human activity. These red sites indicate places where there's a lot of archaeological data showing people were using the landscape actively for thousands of years and spending a lot less time in these areas in the missions at higher elevations. So we're pairing, again, pairing both those records across this gradient and really heavy human use and less heavy. And what we're finding, this is just kind of preliminary, but from Kathy Whitlock's work and her students, and also some of the preliminary results from our work, we're seeing that there's just a lot of variability in the different sites, very dynamic fire regimes. But interestingly, we see this kind of persistence of mixed conifer forests. Again, we don't have a lot of the pollen records from our sites, the new sites that we have, but from Kathy's work and some of the initial findings, we don't see major transitions occurring like we do certainly in New Zealand. And so that kind of piques our interest. Well, why? What's different? These are, they overlap in biophysical setting. We know indigenous peoples are managing the landscape to some degree. Why don't we see, transitions like we do in New Zealand? So this is a big question we're hoping to answer. And, we kind of, I guess, put forth a white paper in Bioscience just a little while ago, putting forth this idea that Douglas fir is probably one of the big reasons. The unique characteristics of the dominant canopy species in the Pacific Northwest, really buffers these systems from real rapid transitions and these tipping points. It's got, Douglas fir is well adapted to a range of fire severities. It's got thick bark, elevated crown, it can disperse quite long distances. And in most of the Pacific Northwest, you have a complex diversity of age classes. So it's well adapted to fire. It doesn't mean there isn't fire in these forests or that people were using fire. It's just that you don't have conversion from forest to some other open landscape, grasslands or scrub or something like that. You often have some mortality, but the forests remain intact. And again, coming back to this post-fire conditions, in most Douglas fir forests, or mixed conifer forests, you see a fairly rapid decrease in flammability. So this is different than the models we typically use in terms of the flammability of the hazard function, but you do have an elevated flammability in Pacific Northwest forests, but it's very short. Again, you get bracken fern oftentimes when you have a fire in Douglas fir forest, but this doesn't last very long, and so you don't have much opportunity for another fire to come in and maintain that or kind of set that into a new state. So we think that this rapid decrease in flammability after a fire is stabilizing succession and stabilizing these forests so that they're not being converted, or that it's really difficult to convert them. So just to emphasize this point, in New Zealand, you've got this elevated landscape flammability. If you can target ignitions here, you can trap succession here and create a new fire-prone state. Whereas in the Pacific Northwest, that's really difficult to do because it's a shorter time period. And you also have trees that are much more adapted to fire. So another new project, this is something that kind of builds on Bruce Maxwell and Anibal Pouchard and Lisa Roux and Kim Taylor. They've been working in Chile for a little while, in Argentina. Having worked with them a little bit, we all kind of worked on putting a full bite proposal together, and unfortunately only one person gets it, so I guess I'm going to add on to what they're doing and work with them, looking at altered fire regimes in Chile. And this is some of our first results that in terms of just the first thing we want to do to add on to the work that they're doing is to just document trends in fire activity for the central region of Chile that is really poorly studied in terms of fire activity. And we're seeing increases in fire. It's been in the news a lot. You've got big fires in Valparaiso, in Santiago, all throughout this central Chilean region. And so what we're doing, this is a MaxEnt model looking at, really thinking of fire as a species. So where is fire most likely to occur given the data that we have for the last 15 years from MODIS satellite imagery? And the things that jump out from our first runs with using MaxEnt species distribution model, thinking of, again, fire as a species, is temperature. It's kind of a no-brainer. It's getting temperatures, warm temperatures drive fire activity. Land use is a huge one, and we think there's a couple things that are going on here. One is agriculture. There's a lot of burning of agricultural lands in these the lowlands areas before you get to the Andes, but also there's pine plantations that are changing fuel dynamics that are also burning, and I'm going to talk more about this in a second. And then again, vegetation type, so non-native versus native communities. A lot of these areas in the foothills of the Andes to the coast are highly altered in terms of their species composition. And in Concepcion and this area here is, I don't know, Bruce, if it can claim to fame being one of the most highly altered plant communities in the world. You should think it's up there, right? We think that could be a real big driver of increased fire activity in this region. So we're looking at that. And what Bruce and Kim and Annabelle and Lisa have been looking at are, in terms of altered fire regimes, you've got pine invasions. Lodgepole pine is, here's the plantation, and here are wilding pines or wildings that are expanding into a kind of a sagebrush steppe. And what Kim's found on a paper she's working on right now is that where you have low density or moderate density invasions, even if you get fire, you get recovery of native species. You eventually go back to the sagebrush steppe. But if you have much higher density invasion, one, you kind of, even without fire, you kind of stay in an altered community state. But if you have fire, you really get stuck. You cross a threshold at which you have a lot more fuel in the landscape, which promotes more fire. And it's a really interesting altered state, and she's documenting that in a paper she's working on right now. And just some data that from that paper, just showing that your fuel loads are increasing with over time, and also with your density of invasion. So it's a really interesting thing that's happening. And unfortunately, this is happening in a lot of places in South America, both Argentina and Chile. So it's a big concern. So for the Fulbright that I'm going on in a few months, one of the things that I'm going to focus on is looking at these Araucaria forests, which are a very interesting forest. They have a very limited distribution in South America. This is Chile and then Argentina. They're kind of an ancient tree. They dominated much of the earth 70 to 200 million years ago. They had a very broad distribution. They covered a ton of ground in the tropics and subtropics millions of years ago. Now they're very narrow distribution. There's a little bit in Australia and Indonesia, but they're actually quite an interesting species. They have a thick bark, and again, elevated crown base, so we think they're adapted to fire, but very little is known about their interactions with fire. And there's been quite a few repeated fires in Araucaria Forests in the last decade, 2002, 2012, and this year and last year, a lot of the Araucaria forests have been burned. And even though we know that they're slightly fire adapted, these repeated fires and possibly different intensity fires where you have introduced conifers like lodgepole pine, can they survive these new conditions? That's what we want to be asking. And so I'm going to be working with Bruce and Kim and Annabelle and Lisa and Andres Holtz from UC Portland State University to really look at, how are these repeated fires going to affect, one, post-fire establishment, but also recovery mortality. Is there more crowning? Those types of questions. So the first thing we're really going to do is just document trends in fire activity and then kind of focus on some of these Araucaria forests. So the last area, I was going to skip this, but I'm going to talk about just for a second because Mary brought to my attention that PBS is showing a 6-part series on Gorongosa Gorongosa National Park. It started last night, and I highly recommend that you check it out because it's a really interesting part of the world. It's kind of the reestablishment and recovery of a very diverse park in central Mozambique, where I had a chance to work. I got a National Geographic grant a few years ago, worked with some folks from the University of Edinburgh and the park, and other folks from Europe to reconstruct the long-term fire history for an area that, we know there's a lot of fire, but they had no information on, what the historical fire regime was like. So it's, again, in central Mozambique. What's interesting is these are all long-term paleo environmental records, and there's this huge gap. There's just really no records of environmental change or fire activity or anything. This is the only record that we know of, other than this Marine Corps, that has very coarse resolution for this whole region. And so we're very excited to try to fill this geographical gap. And there's a lot of interesting climatic questions. The ITCZ has shifted in latitude over time, and this is in the perfect location to try to detect that shift. We've also got the Indian Ocean temperatures, which influence precipitation delivery across southern Africa, and it's also in a really unique position to kind of figure out some of these long-term climatic changes. So again, this is a preliminary record from our peak court from the top of Mount Gorongosa at around 1,700 meters. And so this is it's about a 28,000-year record going to present. And you can see fire activity. These are local fire events. It was fairly low until the kind of the beginning of the Holocene, this Pleistocene-Holocene transition. And then you get a dramatic increase in the last millennia, coinciding with kind of Iron Age development in this area, or when there's a lot of Iron Age technology developing. This is represents rainfall delivery from a record, so it's fairly wet in the late Pleistocene, and then the Pleistocene-Holocene transition, it dries out, and then it starts to get a little bit wetter at the end. Temperatures in the red line here. It's quite cool until you get, again, into the early Holocene with a peak in the mid-Holocene. So what we find is that the record, during this wet and cool time period, podocarp forests are dominating the pollen record. As conditions get a little drier and warmer, you see a little uptick in fire activity and a large expansion of grasses, and a decline in the podocarps in Araucaria. So kind of Araucaria heathlands are really declining. And then in the last millennia, you see a lot more fire activity, higher than anywhere else in the record. And again, when we look at what's driving these changes in community type, and you see that rainfall amount and charcoal accumulation and the number of fires is really an important factor driving ecosystem transitions in central Mozambique. And it's this rainfall fire feedback that we think is responsible for this huge expansion in grasslands during the early Holocene. And then, we think these are the Iron Age advent. There's a lot of archaeological data around the mountain, right around 1,000 years ago, that starts to develop. We think that's, it's corresponding to that huge rise in fire activity. If you look at fire activity on the mountain today over the last 14 years or so, you have a lot of fire activity. These are fire incidents at different elevations. But this, if you look at, you think of that 28,000-year record, except for the beginning of the early Holocene, where we see that expansion of grasslands, and the last millennia, this type of fire activity is really unprecedented when you compare it to the rest of the record. So we see a pretty significant shift that's going on today. And if you hike up the mountain, which I encourage you to do, Mary, you've done this, right? When you hike up, you're really hiking up through forest, rainforest that's been converted, or cloud forest that's been converted by folks, you know, cultivating new grounds. And I mean, it's an incredible closed rainforest that is really getting converted every day. But luckily, the park just included everything above 700 meters in a protected area a couple of years ago. So they're trying to kind of slow that conversion of the last remaining bits of the cloud forest on the top of the mountain. So just to kind of wrap up, the main theme that comes out of these case studies for us is that post-fire conditions are, and changes in post-fire conditions are really important for understanding where we're going to have rapid transitions in the future. And I think this, you know, this idea that we have, you know, we've got elevated flammability after fires, even in the Pacific Northwest, certainly especially in South America. But now we have a lot of changing conditions that here and elsewhere, we've got added emissions from land use and people. We've got new novel plant communities that are more flammable than the native plant communities. You've got loss of seed sources and organic soils, and your microclimate is changing, and all those combine to alter this curve, this post-fire curve, which you know, I think is really going to, in many places in the world, in temperate forests especially, where you have a lot of fuel, it's going to have some dramatic impacts. And that, getting back to this kind of simple conceptual diagram, again, I'm really interested in those types of dynamics where you have a lot of fuel on the landscape already. So you're not limited by fuel, you're just limited by the flammability of that fuel. So what should we expect in the future? Well, this idea of a fire deficit. Here's fire activity for the western United States, and the predicted fire activity is this dashed line here, and the actual fire activity is this red line. So fire ecologists are calling that, or paleoecologists are calling that a fire deficit, in the sense that we should have been burning a lot more than we are, which means there's a lot of fuel that is left unburned on the landscape. So are we in this fire deficit, and is climate eventually going to catch up to this deficit? And is 2015 an example of, at some point, it is going to start burning? And Matt Jolly and others came out with a paper recently that shows, you know, the predictions for the western United States is quite a lot of new fire activity. So what should we be doing if we've got not only increased fire activity, but we've got you know, pine beetle disturbances, all these conditions that set us up for a lot of fires? Should we hire more firefighters? This is the percentage of the Forest Service just put this out, I think, a week ago. In 1998, the number of people working on other things to maintain forests, and the number of firefighters, and that's the way it is now. So we've got more firefighters working for the Forest Service than we have doing anything else. And in terms of the money that we're spending on fires, it's just increasing up to 50% of our budget now, and it's projected to be, you know, almost 70% in 2025. So I guess what I want to put out there is that kind of what Julio, Ben Corbin was here was suggesting, and others, Dick Waring, Dennis Odian, have suggested that really what we need to do is manage succession where we can, where it's feasible, facilitate diverse age classes so that we don't have all the same age classes that are could be catastrophic in terms of if they're all burning. But in remote areas, you know, we should just let disturbances processes play out and stop putting out fires in very remote areas where there's no people. So I'll end there and thank a lot of students, folks in our paleoecology lab, and folks around the world have contributed to research, and hopefully we have time for a question.
Okay, I think we have some time for some questions, but I just want to talk, so if people need to step out, they can get up there. Probably do some questions. Thank you.
Jack.
Cool stuff, Dave. So I'm pretty unfamiliar with the knowledge of you, but I'm wondering if, in the time series analysis you have from the lake sediments, you often have sufficient resolution, say, charcoal and plant transitions in the pollen or other records in which you could calculate lags in order to determine causality. Just because two things in the time series are not correlated doesn't mean they're not causally affecting each other.
Yeah, I mean, with varve sediments, you certainly have a much higher capacity to do that, and people have done that. But varve sediments, so annual results, lake sediments are very hard to come by. But there's certainly, Virginia Glacius in our lab has been using GAMS, and I think it's addressing some of the statistical questions, but some of the causality is hard to get at even if you've got those. These factors are interacting together in terms of climate or human-set fires. But in some ways, I think if you rely too much on the statistics with some of these obvious records, it's not really necessary. But inferring causality even with improved like varve sediments is pretty. You still have to make the leap that the correlations are really strong.
One second, more of a comment that is really cool. Here's the island that's in Tasmania. Casuarina is a raging nitrogen user, which you would expect to increase in abundance in time of nitrogen deficiency in soils. But that looks like that's even happening. It looks like a significant time lag.
Yeah, exactly. So we've been going back and forth, David Bowman and some of the botanists and plant physiologists at the University of Tasmania. We've been discussing this lag and also what's going on there. And part of the problem we have is that the archaeological evidence disappears, but it doesn't mean that people couldn't have been around for another, couple hundred, even 1,000 years. So that we worry that we're relying too much on we don't want to use the archaeological data to make it precise. They're absent this date. It could, there's no archaeological evidence after 4,500 years ago, but when did people actually were they depopulated? So we think there's some slush in exactly when that occurred, but I think that's a really good point that the response of Casuarina could be, this interesting, soil edaphic condition feedback. And certainly the plant physiologists from University of Tasmania think that it's a big ENSO signal. That when you start getting this huge swings in precipitation delivery and temperature, Casuarina benefits from that until it gets so extreme that coliatrus takes over. So I don't know. Go ahead.
On the Planter Island study, do you have samples from either Tasmania or Victoria north there? So, because then what you presented, you're comparing one sample kind of on the island over time.
Yeah, we have. Yeah, certainly. There's several records from southeastern Victoria and Tasmanian mainland itself. And in terms of the vegetation, it's very different. Flinders Island is quite unique, which we think. So Tasmania and the mainland Australia had human occupation at least 50,000 years continuously to present. So we don't have that present absence. We think that partially describes the differences in our record at Flinders Island. But also you have this unique rise in coliatrus at the end of the record we don't see elsewhere. And we think that the ENSO variability in the Bass Strait was pretty significant for for those islands. But yeah, and I didn't show those regional comparisons, but yeah.
Well, thanks a
Thanks a
lot.
lot.